The millionaire cruelly abandoned the woman he loved. 25 years later, he froze when he saw a waitress identical to her in a luxury restaurant. He walked closer. Chicago, 1998. The city skyline glittered against the evening sky as Katherine Moore stood on the rooftop garden of the Donovan Tower, her chestnut hair dancing in the breeze. At 23, she was still naive enough to believe in fairy tales, especially the one she was living. One day, all of this will seem small compared to what we'll build together, Richard Donovan whispered. Wrapping his arms around her from behind, Katherine leaned into his embrace, savoring the warmth of his body against the cool spring air. I don't need towers or empires, Richard. Just you. He spun her around. His blue eyes, those devastating Donovan blues that had made him Chicago's most eligible bachelor, locked onto hers. You deserve both, Kate, and I promise you'll have them. They were from different worlds. Katherine, a nursing student working part-time at the hospital cafeteria, where they'd met 6 months ago, when Richard came in after visiting a sick friend. And Richard, heir to the Donovan fortune, groomed since birth to take over his family's vast holdings in real estate, banking, and politics. Their love was the talk of Chicago's elite circles, most of it unkind. She's after his money, just another gold digger. Victoria will never allow it. Victoria, even the thought of Richard's mother sent a chill through Katherine. The woman's cold assessment whenever they were in the same room made Katherine feel like an insect under a microscope. You're thinking about my mother again, Richard said, reading her expression with the ease of someone completely attuned to her feelings. I'm sorry, it's just... Don't apologize for her behavior. His jaw tightened. She'll come around. Once she sees how happy we are. How could she not? Katherine smiled, wanting desperately to believe him. But Victoria Donovan wasn't just any mother. She was a kingmaker who had orchestrated her family's rise from wealthy to politically powerful. The Donovans had produced senators, governors, and there was talk of Richard himself running for office one day. What place would a girl from the South Side have in that world? Promise me something, Katherine said, suddenly serious. Anything. No matter what happens, no matter what people say or do, we face it together. No secrets between us. Richard kissed her then, deeply and with such conviction that her doubts melted away. I promise, you and me against the world. Kate. 3 weeks later, that promise shattered. Katherine stood frozen in the grand foyer of the Donovan mansion, the echo of Richard's accusations still ringing in her ears. How could you, with my own cousin? His voice had never sounded so cold. Richard, please, it's not true. I've never even been alone with James. Someone's lying to you. But Richard's eyes had hardened, those blue depths now frozen over with something she'd never seen directed at her before. Contempt. Save it, Katherine. I have proof. He threw a manila envelope at her feet. Photographs spilled out. Doctored images that made it appear she was embracing James Donovan intimately. These are fake, Richard. You know me. I thought I did. His voice dropped to a whisper. My mother warned me about women like you. The words hit like physical blows. Behind Richard, Victoria stood in the doorway, her face a mask of concern that didn't reach her calculating eyes. Richard, darling, perhaps it's best if Miss Moore leaves now. This is all so unseemly. Katherine looked from Victoria to Richard, sudden understanding dawning. She did this. Your mother set this up. Don't you dare blame my mother for your betrayal, Richard shouted, his composure finally breaking. Get out. It's over. Katherine reached for him one last time. Richard, listen to me. I love you. I would never... Security will see you out, Victoria interrupted smoothly. And Katherine, that confidentiality agreement you signed when you started dating my son. Remember that violating it means legal consequences. Katherine staggered backward, her world imploding. As the security guards approached, she looked one last time at Richard, searching for any sign of the man who had promised to stand with her against the world. But he had already turned away. In her tiny apartment that night, Katherine huddled on the bathroom floor, staring at the positive pregnancy test in her hands. 2 weeks ago, it would have been the happiest news of her life. Now, it was a cruel twist of fate. A baby. Richard's baby. Her hand drifted to her still flat stomach. What was she going to do? Her nursing studies were only half finished. Her family back in Missouri could barely support themselves, let alone help with a child. But the thought of not having this baby, this last piece of Richard, never crossed her mind. "We'll figure it out," she whispered to her unborn child. Somehow, the next morning, Katherine called the one person who might still help her reach Richard, his longtime driver, Frank, who had always been kind to her. "Miss Moore, I don't think that's a good idea," Frank said, his voice heavy with regret. "Things are complicated right now. Frank, please. I need to tell him something important. He deserves to know." A long pause. "I'll try, miss, that's all I can promise." 3 days later, Katherine received a certified letter. Inside was a check for $50,000 and a legal document stating that in exchange for the money, she would never contact Richard or any member of the Donovan family again. There was no personal note, no acknowledgement of their time together that night. Katherine tore up the check and cried until there were no tears left. The next morning, she wrote a letter to Richard about the baby and mailed it to his private office address. It was returned unopened with "refused" stamped across the envelope. 2 months later, Katherine was approached after her shift at the hospital by an elegantly dressed woman who introduced herself as Richard's aunt. "He's distraught, dear," the woman said, her British accent lending credibility to her claim of being Victoria's sister-in-law. "He won't admit it, but he misses you terribly. The family is worried about him." Hope flickered in Katherine's heart. "He does. Of course, this misunderstanding has gone on long enough. I've convinced Victoria to arrange a reconciliation, somewhere private, away from prying eyes." The next day, Katherine was driven to what she was told was a Donovan country estate. Instead, it was a remote convent, hours from Chicago. By the time she realized it was a trap, the gates had locked behind her, and men in orderly uniforms were approaching with sedatives. "This is for your own good," said the woman who had claimed to be Richard's aunt. "You'll be cared for until the baby comes. After that, well, the child will be raised properly, and you won't have to worry about the shame of being an unwed mother." As the needle slid into her arm and darkness closed in, Katherine's last thought was of Richard's promise. "You and me against the world, Kate." But the world had won. The convent walls loomed like sentinels against the pale Montana sky. St. Bernadette's Home for Troubled Women, a bland name that concealed its true purpose for the wealthy families of America. It was where inconvenient pregnancies disappeared. Katherine awoke in a sparse room, the effects of the sedative making her head pound. White walls, a small crucifix, a narrow bed. The door was locked from the outside. "Good morning, Sarah." A nun with stern features entered, carrying a tray. "I'm Sister Agnes. How are you feeling today?" "My name is Katherine," she said, her voice raspy. "Katherine Moore." Sister Agnes shook her head. "Your paperwork says Sarah Williams. You were admitted for delusional behavior and protection during your confinement. Your family is very concerned. This is kidnapping. I need to call the police." The nun's expression didn't change. "The doctor said you might be confused. Your condition causes these fantasies. I'm not Sarah. I'm Katherine Moore from Chicago, and I was brought here against my will." Sister Agnes placed the tray on a small table. "Eat your breakfast, doctor. Reynolds will see you this afternoon." When the door closed, Katherine rushed to it, pounding her fists until they bruised. No one came. Dr. Reynolds turned out to be a silver-haired man with dead eyes, who spoke about her as if she weren't in the room. "Typical presentation," he told Sister Agnes while examining Katherine. "The delusions are consistent with her diagnosis. Continue the medication. No outside contact until after delivery." "I'm not delusional," Katherine shouted. "Call Richard Donovan in Chicago. He'll—" "Fixation on a prominent figure, also common," Dr. Reynolds made a note. "Increase the evening dose." Days blurred into weeks. Katherine's pregnancy progressed under constant supervision. The other women, 7 of them, moved through the halls like ghosts. Some truly seemed troubled, muttering to themselves or staring blankly at walls. Others, like Katherine, had clear eyes that darted toward exits or followed the staff's movements, searching for weaknesses. "They've got you too, huh?" whispered a blonde girl named Melissa during chapel one day. "Who was your mistake?" "Mine was a congressman's son, the heir to the Donovan fortune," Katherine whispered back. Melissa's eyes widened. Jesus, no wonder you're locked down tighter than Fort Knox. Through Melissa, Katherine learned the truth about St. Bernadette's. For over 30 years, it had served as a discreet solution for politically connected families. Wayward daughters were genuinely treated for mental health issues, but others, the pregnant girlfriends and mistresses, were held until delivery. Then their babies were quietly adopted by appropriate families. What happens to the mothers? Katherine asked. Melissa shrugged. Depends how much trouble they cause. Be a good girl. Sign the papers. You go home with enough cash to start over somewhere new. Fight them. Her voice trailed off. Katherine placed her hands protectively over her growing belly. I won't let them take my baby. Then you better get smart real fast. Under Melissa's guidance, Katherine learned to fake taking her medication. She documented the staff's routines and shift changes. She identified which nuns might be sympathetic. Most importantly, she pretended to accept her situation, becoming the model patient. By her 7th month, Katherine had earned minor privileges: supervised walks in the garden, access to the common room. She used this freedom to collect small, useful items: a pen here, a bobby pin there, a kitchen knife wrapped in a napkin and hidden beneath her mattress. The plan was simple but desperate. Wait for a night when Sister Frances, the oldest and kindest of the nuns, was on duty alone. Use the bobby pin on the lock. Reach the garage where deliveries were made. Take Sister Frances's keys. Freedom. When the night came, Katherine's hands trembled as she worked the lock. The click of the mechanism releasing felt impossibly loud in the silence. The corridor stretched before her, dark and empty. She made it to the garage, found the keys, started the ancient station wagon. The engine's roar seemed to shake the building. As she pulled away, headlights illuminated Sister Frances in the doorway, her face a mask of shock and, was it relief? Katherine drove recklessly down the mountain road, adrenaline coursing through her veins. The baby kicked vigorously, as if sensing their bid for freedom. We're going to make it, she whispered. We're going home. She never saw the deer until it was too late. The station wagon swerved, the world spun. Glass shattered as the vehicle rolled down the embankment. Pain, darkness, then nothing. She's waking up. Katherine's eyes fluttered open to unfamiliar faces. Not the nuns or Dr. Reynolds, but different ones. Kinder faces lined with concern. Where? Her voice cracked. You're at St. Mary's Hospital in Burlington, Vermont, said a gentle-voiced woman in doctor's scrubs. I'm Dr. Patel. You've been in an accident. Katherine's hands flew to her stomach, flat, empty. My baby. Terror gripped her. Your daughter is fine, Dr. Patel said quickly. She's small, but healthy, 6 pounds even. Relief flooded through her, followed immediately by suspicion. Where is she? I want to see her. Soon. She's in the NICU as a precaution. Can you tell us your name? Katherine opened her mouth, then stopped. What if they contacted St. Bernadette's? Or worse, the Donovans? I don't remember. Dr. Patel exchanged glances with a gray-haired man in priest's clothing who stood nearby. You had no identification when they found you, the priest said. The car belonged to St. Bernadette's convent in Montana, but they claim no record of a pregnant resident matching your description. Katherine's thoughts raced. They were covering their tracks, denying she was ever there. The head trauma could explain the memory loss, Dr. Patel offered. Let's focus on your recovery for now. Later, when they left her alone, Katherine wept silently. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had happened. Richard's betrayal, Victoria's scheme, the months of captivity, and now this strange limbo. The next morning, the priest returned. I'm Father Thomas from the local parish, he said, sitting beside her bed. I'd like to help you, if I may. Something in his eyes, a depth of understanding, made Katherine want to trust him. They took me because of my baby, she whispered. Powerful people who didn't want me in their son's life. Father Thomas nodded, unsurprised. I've heard of such places. What will you do now? I don't know. They'll come looking for the baby. Perhaps it's time for a new beginning, he suggested carefully. Our community is small but caring. People here mind their own business. There's a position open at the elder care home that comes with a small cottage on the grounds. The sisters there are discreet. Why would you help me? You don't even know me. Father Thomas smiled sadly. Let's just say I've seen enough injustice in this world to recognize it instantly. Sometimes, the only way forward is a complete reinvention. 3 days later, Claire Bennett, a young widow who had lost her husband in the same accident that affected her memory, was welcomed to the small town of Shelburne, Vermont, with her newborn daughter, Haley. As she settled into the cottage behind Good Shepherd Elder Care, Katherine knew she should feel grateful for this chance at safety. But at night, holding her daughter, who already showed signs of having Richard's blue eyes, she couldn't help but wonder if they would ever be truly free from the shadows of the Donovan family. What she didn't know was that back in Chicago, a manila envelope had landed on Richard's desk. Inside was a report from the private investigator he'd hired after months of doubt about Katherine's betrayal. The report contained evidence of Victoria's elaborate scheme, including the forged photos and financial transactions to St. Bernadette's convent. But when Richard confronted his mother, Victoria had smiled coldly and said, "It's too late now. Katherine Moore died in a car accident last week. Tragic, really." And Richard, believing yet another of his mother's calculated lies, had locked himself in his office and mourned the woman he'd failed to protect. Chicago, 2023. The evening rush at Bellissimo, one of the city's most exclusive restaurants, was in full swing. White-jacketed servers glided between tables while the city's elite discussed million-dollar deals over $80 steaks. "Table 14 needs another bottle of the Camus," Haley Moore told the sommelier as she passed, balancing 3 plates of perfectly seared scallops. At 25, she moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been in the service industry far longer than her age suggested. "On it, Haley," Marco replied, already reaching for the wine. "How's that table of investment bros treating you?" She rolled her eyes. "Third round of drinks and still haven't looked at the menu, but they tip well, so I'm not complaining." Haley delivered the scallops with a warm smile that never quite reached her eyes. That smile, professional, practiced, protective, had served her well since leaving Vermont at 18. It was the smile of someone who had learned early that vulnerability was a luxury she couldn't afford. Between orders, she checked her phone. A text from her advisor at Northwestern. "Scholarship committee meeting tomorrow. Looking good, but fingers crossed." Haley took a deep breath. After 6 years of night classes, working double shifts, and living on ramen, she was 1 semester away from her degree in social work. The scholarship would mean she could quit her second job at the coffee shop and focus on her final internship. Haley, Maria, the hostess, called across the restaurant. "Got another VIP heading to the private dining room. Mr. Shaw wants you to handle it." Great. VIPs meant more money, but also more performative fawning, something Haley had never been good at despite years of practice. "Who is it this time?" she asked, straightening her crisp black shirt. "Some finance guy, Donovan. Drives a Bentley, so definitely your kind of tipper." Donovan. The name brushed against something in Haley's memory, but she dismissed it. In a city like Chicago, she'd heard thousands of names over the years. The private dining room was Bellissimo's crown jewel, a secluded space with its own entrance for celebrities and business tycoons who preferred discretion. As Haley approached, she mentally prepared her VIP routine, attentive but not intrusive, knowledgeable but not presumptuous. The man sitting alone at the table had his back to her, silver-streaked dark hair, broad shoulders, and an impeccably tailored suit. Something about his posture triggered an odd déjà vu. "Good evening, sir. Welcome to Bellissimo. My name is Haley, and I'll be taking care of you tonight." When he turned, time seemed to slow. His face was handsome in that polished way of the very wealthy, but it was his eyes that caught her, startlingly blue, like pieces of sky trapped in ice. For a moment, he stared at her as if seeing a ghost. "Sir?" Haley prompted, uncomfortable under his scrutiny. He blinked rapidly. "I'm sorry. You reminded me of someone, that's all." His voice was cultured, with the subtle authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Richard Donovan." "It's a pleasure, Mr. Donovan. May I start you with something from the bar?" Throughout the meal, Haley felt his eyes following her, not in the creepy way she was unfortunately familiar with, but with a puzzled intensity that made her skin prickle. When she brought his dessert, bourbon bread pudding, he finally spoke beyond his order. "Have you worked here long, Haley?" 3 years, sir. You're not from Chicago originally, though." It wasn't a question. Haley's guard went up immediately. "Vermont," she answered curtly. "Will there be anything else?" "Vermont," he repeated softly. "Interesting. No, nothing else, thank you." When he left, his tip was $1,000 on a $400 check. Haley stared at the amount, suspicion overwhelming gratitude. The orphanage dreams came that night, as they often did when she felt unsettled. In her dream, she was 6 again, sitting in the sterile office of St. Agnes Home for Children while Mrs. Winters explained, yet again, why she hadn't been chosen. "Some children are just harder to place, Haley, but we'll keep trying." Dream Haley knew what that meant. Too old, too quiet, too intense, not cute enough, not sweet enough, not enough. She woke at 3 a.m., sheets tangled around her legs in her tiny studio apartment. The familiar ache of loneliness pressed against her chest, as tangible as a hand. Haley padded to the kitchen and made tea, gazing out at the Chicago skyline. She'd chosen this apartment specifically for this view, the lights stretching out like possibilities, reminding her how far she'd come from that sad little girl at St. Agnes. On her modest bookshelf sat her most cherished possession, a handmade wooden box. Inside was a baby blanket with HM embroidered in faded blue thread, and a worn photograph of a young woman with chestnut hair who might have been her mother. These were the only clues to her origins that she'd managed to extract from St. Agnes. They told her she'd been dropped off at 2 months old with no note, no identification beyond the blanket. Registration records listed her mother as Jane Doe and her father as unknown. When she was younger, Haley had created elaborate fantasies about her parents. They were spies, or royalty in hiding, or star-crossed lovers who died tragically. As she grew older, the fantasies faded into a simpler, more painful truth. Whoever they were, they hadn't wanted her enough to stay. At 18, armed with a high school diploma and stubborn determination, Haley had left Vermont. Chicago was big enough to get lost in, far enough to put distance between herself and the pitying looks of a town where everyone knew she was that orphan girl, and bursting with enough opportunities to build something from nothing. It hadn't been easy. The early years were a blur of cheap rooms, cheaper food, and the constant hustle of someone working 2 or 3 jobs while taking community college classes. But Haley had developed a simple philosophy: keep moving forward, no matter what. She'd survived being unwanted. She could survive anything. The next evening at Bellissimo, Maria caught her arm before her shift started. "That VIP from yesterday? He requested you specifically for his party tonight. Private room again." Haley frowned. "Did he say why?" "Nope. But he's bringing 5 people from Donovan Enterprises, so Mr. Shaw is practically doing cartwheels." When she entered the private dining room, Richard Donovan was already seated with his guests. 3 men and 2 women in executive attire. Business dinner then, safer than if he'd shown up alone again. "Ah, Haley," he said with that same strange intensity in his eyes. "Everyone, this is the server I was telling you about. Best service I've had in Chicago." The meal proceeded normally, but Haley couldn't shake the sensation of being watched, evaluated, not just by Donovan, but by his entire party. It was as if they were looking for something in her face, her mannerisms, her voice. As she cleared the entree plates, one of the women, gray-haired, elegant, leaned toward Richard and whispered something. He nodded, his expression grave. When Haley returned with dessert menus, Richard handed her a business card. "My company has a scholarship program for promising students," he said. "I understand you're studying social work at Northwestern. We'd like to consider you." Ice replaced the blood in Haley's veins. "How did you know where I study?" For a moment, he looked caught off guard. "I asked around. The restaurant manager mentioned it." "Lie. Mr. Shaw wouldn't have known or shared that information." "I'm not interested," Haley said flatly, returning the card. "You haven't even heard the details," Richard protested. "Full tuition, living stipend, no strings attached." Haley's voice was sharper than professional standards allowed. "Strange men don't just hand out money without expecting something in return, Mr. Donovan." A flash of what looked like genuine pain crossed his face. "It's not like that." "Then what is it like?" She was aware she was crossing lines, but something about this man, his interest, his eyes that seemed somehow familiar, pushed all her buttons. Richard Donovan stared at her for a long moment, then said quietly, Perhaps we should discuss this privately, after your shift. There's nothing to discuss. Haley took a step back. Please enjoy your desserts. I'll send another server to finish your service. She walked out, heart pounding, knowing she'd probably just cost herself her job. Behind her, she heard one of the men say, "Richard, are you absolutely sure the resemblance is uncanny?" But she didn't hear Richard's response. By the end of her shift, Haley had convinced herself she'd overreacted. People made weird, inappropriate offers in restaurants all the time. She'd handle Richard Donovan like any other boundary-crossing customer. Polite deflection, professional distance. But as she left through the employee entrance, a black Bentley idled at the curb, the window lowered, revealing Richard Donovan's troubled face. "Haley, please. 5 minutes. There's something you need to know. I'm really not interested in whatever this is. It's about your parents." The world tilted beneath her feet. "What? Your mother's name was Katherine Moore," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "And I'm your father." "You're lying." Haley's voice was steel, her body rigid despite the trembling that had started deep inside her chest. Richard Donovan stepped out of the Bentley, his movements careful, as if approaching a frightened animal. "I know how this sounds. You know nothing about me." She took a step back, clutching her bag like a shield. "I don't know what kind of sick game you're playing, but I'm not interested. Please, just hear me out. 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking." Something in his eyes, a haunted vulnerability that seemed at odds with his powerful presence, made Haley hesitate. "There's a diner across the street," she finally said. "Public place. 5 minutes." The diner was nearly empty at that late hour. A fluorescent light flickered above their booth, casting harsh shadows across Richard's face, suddenly making him look older, more worn than he had appeared in the restaurant's flattering lighting. "Talk," Haley demanded, leaving her coat on, ready to leave at any moment. Richard's hands trembled slightly as he placed a manila folder on the table between them. 3 weeks ago, I was diagnosed with an inoperable cerebral aneurysm. This wasn't at all what Haley had expected. "I'm sorry to hear that. But what does your health have to do with me? When you're told you might die soon, it makes you reevaluate your life, especially your regrets." He slid the folder toward her. "My biggest regret has always been Katherine." Haley didn't touch the folder. "Katherine Moore, the woman you claim is my mother." "Yes." Richard's gaze never wavered. "We were together 25 years ago. She was the love of my life, and I destroyed everything because I was too weak to stand up to my family." Despite herself, Haley felt a flicker of curiosity. The name Katherine Moore, the timing, it aligned with the few details she knew about her birth. "So you had a girlfriend a quarter century ago. That doesn't make you my father." After I ended things with Katherine, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The evidence of her betrayal felt too convenient. Richard's voice grew softer. "By the time I started asking questions, it was too late. My mother told me Katherine had died." "Your mother told you?" "Victoria Donovan is a formidable woman who believes the end justifies any means when it comes to protecting our family's position and reputation." Bitterness edged his words. "I believed her for years, until my diagnosis. That's when I hired Dixon." "Who's Dixon?" "The best private investigator money can buy." Richard tapped the folder. He found records of a pregnant woman admitted to St. Bernadette's Convent in Montana under the name Sarah Williams. Dates match. Description matches. And there was a substantial payment from a Donovan shell company to the convent around the same time. Haley's heart pounded in her ears. She'd heard of places like that. Institutions where inconvenient pregnancies were hidden away, babies taken and placed for adoption, records falsified or destroyed. With reluctant fingers, she finally opened the folder. Inside were photocopies of admission records, a grainy photo of a young woman who resembled the picture Haley had treasured all these years, and financial transaction statements. "This doesn't prove anything," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "And it certainly doesn't explain how you found me." Richard's expression softened. "Dixon is thorough. He tracked the Montana records to a car accident, then to a hospital in Vermont. Katherine survived, but apparently suffered memory issues. She was discharged as Claire Bennett. Claire Bennett. The name hit Haley like a physical blow. She'd grown up hearing stories about the kind woman who ran the elder care home in Shelburne, Vermont. Claire Bennett. who had lost her husband and her memories in a tragic accident. Claire, who everyone said had the biggest heart, who sometimes looked at Haley with an inexplicable sadness when she thought no one was watching. "I used to do odd jobs at Good Shepherd," Haley whispered, memories flooding back. "Ms. Bennett would give me cookies and tell me stories." Richard leaned forward. "You knew her." "Not really. She left when I was about 6. Moved away suddenly." Haley's eyes narrowed. "If what you're saying is true, and she's my mother, why would she leave me at an orphanage? Why wouldn't she keep me with her?" Pain flashed across Richard's face. "Dixon is still piecing that together. What we know suggests she didn't leave you voluntarily. The convent's records show the baby was taken immediately after birth. Standard procedure for their special cases." Haley felt sick. She thought of the blanket with her initials, perhaps the only thing her mother had managed to send with her. "And how exactly did you find me?" she asked again, still suspicious. Dixon traced adoption records from St. Agnes that matched the timeline. "Then it was a matter of tracking where you went after you left Vermont." Richard hesitated. "When I saw you at the restaurant, it was like seeing Catherine's ghost. You have her eyes, her expressions. But my coloring..." Haley's hand went instinctively to her dark hair, so unlike the chestnut-haired woman in her photograph. Her blue eyes, the same striking shade as the man sitting across from her. "DNA?" she said suddenly. "If you're really my father, you'd agree to a DNA test. Already taken care of." Richard reached back into the folder and pulled out another document. "A lab report dated 2 days ago. I had the lab rush it after I met you. They used a wine glass from your table. You stole my DNA." Haley was outraged. "That's unethical, invasive, and probably illegal," Richard finished. "I know, but I needed to be certain before approaching you." Haley stared at the report, the scientific jargon swimming before her eyes except for one line. 99.9999998% probability of paternity. "This can't be happening," she muttered. "I know it's a shock." "A shock," Haley laughed, a brittle sound. "You upend my entire existence and call it a shock. For 25 years I believed nobody wanted me. I built my entire life around being unwanted, being alone. And now you just stroll in with your designer suit and your convenient terminal illness and expect..." "What?" "Exactly." Richard's composure cracked. "I don't expect forgiveness, Haley. God knows I don't deserve it. But Katherine is alive. Your mother is alive. If nothing else, I wanted you to know that." "Where?" The question escaped before Haley could stop it. "Dixon found her in Burlington. She still goes by Claire Bennett. She works at a senior living facility there." Haley's mind reeled. Claire Bennett, her mother, alive and only hours away from where she'd grown up. All those years of loneliness, of wondering, when the answers had been so close. Why would she never look for me? The words came out small and wounded, like they were spoken by a much younger Haley. Richard's expression darkened. "That's what I intend to find out. Dixon is still investigating. But if my mother had anything to do with separating you two permanently..." He didn't finish the sentence, but the cold fury in his eyes said enough. 5 minutes had long since passed. But Haley couldn't bring herself to leave. Questions whirled in her mind, each more overwhelming than the last. "Why tell me all this now? What do you want from me?" Richard closed the folder slowly. "Officially, I have 6 months to a year. Unofficially, my doctor says the aneurysm could rupture any time." He met her eyes directly. "I don't want money or forgiveness or even a relationship if you don't want one. But before I die, I need to make this right. I need to reunite you with Katherine, and I need to make sure you're both taken care of." "I don't need your money," Haley said automatically. "I know. You're strong. Independent, like your mother." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "But the truth is, I owe you both a life. 25 years of support, of family, of love. I can't give that back, but I can offer you choices Katherine and you never had because of me." Haley stood abruptly. "I need time to process this." "Of course." Richard wrote a number on a napkin. "This is my private line. When you're ready, if you're ever ready, call me." As Haley walked out into the Chicago night, the napkin burning a hole in her pocket, she felt as though she'd stepped into someone else's life, the solid ground of her identity, hard won through years of self-reliance, had just turned to quicksand beneath her feet. Orphan, abandoned, unwanted, Those labels had defined her for so long. Without them, who was she? Daughter. The word echoed in her mind, foreign and frightening. Daughter of Katherine Moore and Richard Donovan. And somewhere in Vermont, a woman who might be her mother was living, breathing, perhaps even wondering about the baby she'd lost 25 years ago. Burlington, Vermont was experiencing one of those perfect autumn days when Claire Bennett finished her shift at Lakeside Senior Living. The maple trees lining the parking lot blazed crimson and gold against an impossibly blue sky, their falling leaves dancing in the crisp breeze. Heading home. "Claire," asked Darlene, the head nurse, as Claire signed out. "Just a quick stop at the market, Mrs. Patterson needs her special tea." Claire smiled, thinking of the persnickety resident who refused any brand but one specific English import. "You spoil them all," Darlene said with affectionate exasperation. "No wonder they ask for you by name." Claire shrugged, a little embarrassed. "I just try to make their days better." It was what she'd been doing for 25 years, easing the final journeys of the elderly, finding small ways to bring comfort and dignity to lives winding down. The work fulfilled her in ways she couldn't articulate. As if each life she touched somehow balanced a cosmic scale. In her modest sedan, Claire turned on the radio as she navigated the familiar streets of Burlington. The classical station was playing something by Bach. Precise, mathematical, safe. Claire preferred it that way. Certain types of music stirred something uncomfortable in her. Shadows at the edge of her memory that were best left undisturbed. The market was busy with after-work shoppers. Claire moved efficiently through the aisles, selecting Mrs. Patterson's tea and a few items for her own dinner. At the checkout, the teenage clerk was fiddling with the store's sound system. "Sorry about this, Ms. Bennett. Manager wants us to switch to the evening playlist." He rolled his eyes as he scanned her items. The first notes poured through the speakers. A piano intro that made Claire's hands freeze mid-air as she reached for her wallet. A woman's voice followed, singing about lost love and moonlight. "Dancing in your arms under Chicago stars." The world tilted. A flash of memory. Strong arms around her waist, the glittering skyline spread below them. The scent of expensive cologne mingled with night air. "Ms. Bennett, you okay?" The clerk's voice seemed to come from very far away. Claire gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles white. "Fine, just dizzy for a moment." But she wasn't fine. By the time she reached her car, her hands were shaking so badly she dropped her keys twice. The song had awakened something, a hairline crack in the wall that had separated Claire Bennett from whoever she'd been before. Katherine. The name rose unbidden in her mind. Katherine Moore, her real name. The cottage Claire had called home for over 2 decades was a small but charming Cape Cod on the outskirts of Burlington. She'd bought it 15 years ago with her careful savings, transforming it into a peaceful sanctuary with a garden that was the envy of her neighbors. But tonight, the cottage felt like a stranger's home. Claire moved through the rooms in a daze, looking at familiar objects with new eyes. Who had chosen these things? Claire Bennett or Katherine Moore? In the bedroom, she knelt by the cedar chest at the foot of her bed. With trembling fingers, she lifted the lid and removed layers of carefully folded quilts until she reached the false bottom. There, wrapped in acid-free tissue paper, lay the only tangible link to her past, a small album of newspaper clippings and a silver locket she'd never had the courage to open. Until now, the locket was tarnished from years of neglect. Katherine, pried it open with a fingernail. Inside was a tiny photograph of a newborn baby and a curl of dark hair. "Haley," she whispered, the name feeling right on her tongue. Memories began to surface, not in a flood, but in disjointed fragments. A hospital room, a nurse placing a swaddled infant in her arms, the devastating emptiness when they took the baby away, a nun with kind eyes slipping her the locket, whispering, "So you'll never forget." Katherine pressed the locket to her chest as tears streamed down her face. How could she have forgotten her own child? What kind of mother forgets? The phone rang, startling her. She answered automatically. "Claire, it's Thomas. I was just checking in. You seemed upset after Mrs. Abernathy's service yesterday." Father Thomas, the priest who had helped her all those years ago, the one constant presence in her life since the accident. I need to see you," Katherine said, her voice strange to her own ears. "Something's happening. I'm remembering. A long pause. Then, quietly, I'll be right over. Father Thomas had aged well, his hair now completely silver but his eyes still sharp and kind. He sat across from Katherine at her kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of tea she didn't remember making. How long have you known? Katherine asked, the locket now hanging around her neck, a tangible weight against her chest. The old priest sighed heavily. I suspected from the beginning. The circumstances of your arrival were suspicious. A young woman with a convenient case of amnesia, fleeing a convent known for handling difficult situations for wealthy families. Why didn't you tell me? What would I have told you? Katherine, that I believed you'd been imprisoned against your will, that your baby had likely been taken for adoption, that whoever put you in that convent might still be looking for you. He shook his head. You were traumatized, vulnerable. Your mind created Claire Bennett as protection. Katherine absorbed this. The anger she wanted to feel tempered by the knowledge that he had given her sanctuary. And my baby, my Haley. I tried to find her, Father Thomas admitted, but those places are very good at covering their tracks. Closed adoptions, falsified records, without knowing who was behind your confinement. I feared making inquiries might expose you to danger. It was the Donovans, Katherine said, the name bitter on her tongue. Richard's mother, Victoria. She arranged everything. Father Thomas's expression darkened. The Chicago Donovans. That explains the resources that would have been necessary for such an elaborate scheme. Katherine stood abruptly and moved to the window, staring out at her garden now silvered by moonlight. I need to find my daughter. Katherine, it's been 25 years. She could be anywhere. She's my child, Thomas. Her voice broke. All these years, I've felt this emptiness, like I was missing something vital. Now I know what it was. Who it was. The priest was silent for a long moment. Then he said carefully, what if she doesn't want to be found? She's an adult now, with her own life. The thought was like a knife to Katherine's heart, but she squared her shoulders. Then that's her choice to make. But she deserves to know the truth, that she wasn't abandoned or unwanted, that she was stolen. Father Thomas studied her face, the determined set of her jaw, the fierce light in her eyes. Claire Bennett had been gentle, accommodating, even passive at times, but this woman before him now was all Katherine Moore, the fighter who had escaped a fortified convent while heavily pregnant. I have a friend in Chicago with connections to private investigators who specialize in reuniting families, he said finally. Discreet professionals who understand the sensitivity of these situations. I'll call him tomorrow. Katherine nodded, already mentally preparing for what lay ahead. She would need to take a leave of absence from work. Pack. Research the Donovans to understand what she might be up against. There's something else you should consider, Father Thomas added gently. Richard Donovan. If you're going to find Haley, you may have to confront him as well. At the mention of Richard's name, Katherine felt a complex wave of emotions. Anger, hurt, and something else she wasn't ready to examine. I'll deal with Richard if I have to, but he's not my priority. Haley is. After Father Thomas left, Katherine found herself standing in the spare bedroom she'd always kept immaculately prepared for guests who rarely came. Now she understood why she'd painted it that particular shade of blue, why she'd placed the small stuffed rabbit on the bookshelf, why she'd always felt a pang when she entered this room. It was the nursery she'd never gotten to create for Haley. Katherine sat on the edge of the bed, clutching the stuffed rabbit. Now that the memories had started to return, they wouldn't stop. Richard's smile, the sound of his laugh, the way he'd looked at her as if she were the most precious thing in the world, the plans they'd made, the life they'd imagined, all destroyed by lies and manipulation. Her phone chimed with a text message. Father Thomas, my friend says his best investigator can start tomorrow. Be prepared. This may move quickly. Katherine closed her eyes, a curious calm settling over her. For 25 years, she'd been Claire Bennett, living a half-life, haunted by shadows she couldn't name. Now, she was Katherine Moore again, and Katherine Moore had a daughter to find and a score to settle with the Donovans. Whatever it took, however long it required, she would reclaim what had been stolen from her. Her identity, her child, her truth. I'm coming, Haley, she whispered to the empty room. I promise I'm coming. The Donovan estate sprawled across 5 acres in Chicago's most exclusive suburb, behind its wrought iron gates and perfectly manicured hedges. Generations of power and privilege had shaped the city's destiny. Today, those gates parted to admit a silver Bentley carrying 3 people whose lives had been shattered by that same power. "This is a mistake," Haley said, staring up at the imposing Georgian mansion. "We should have met on neutral ground." Richard glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "My mother refuses to leave the estate these days. Claims it's for security reasons, but really it's about control. And you're sure she'll be alone?" Katherine asked from the passenger seat, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions beneath the surface. "As alone as Victoria ever is. Just her personal assistant and the household staff, all of whom will disappear with one word from her." Richard's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. "Remember, my mother believes you're dead, Katherine. Seeing you alive will be quite a shock." "Good," Katherine said simply. The 3 weeks since Katherine had arrived in Chicago had been a whirlwind of revelations and cautious reconnections. When Richard's private investigator had called to inform him that Katherine Moore, now Claire Bennett, was actively searching for her daughter, he'd arranged their meeting at a small hotel outside the city. Haley had insisted on being present. She still didn't trust Richard, still couldn't bring herself to call him father, but her curiosity about Katherine had overcome her reservations. That first meeting had been awkward, emotional, and incomplete. Too many years of separation, too many wounds still raw. Katherine had reached for Haley, then stopped herself, respecting the wariness in her daughter's eyes. Haley had asked pointed questions, seeking certainty that this woman was indeed her mother. Richard had watched from a distance, giving them space while providing documents, photos, and other evidence to fill the 25-year void. Now, 3 weeks later, they had formed a fragile alliance with a common purpose, confronting the architect of their collective tragedy, Victoria Donovan. "Richard, darling, what a lovely surprise." Victoria glided into the formal sitting room, elegant even at 78. Her silver hair was perfectly coiffed, her tailored suit exuding old money confidence. "You should have called ahead." She stopped abruptly, noticing the 2 women who had risen from the antique settee. For a moment, genuine shock cracked her aristocratic composure. "What is the meaning of this?" "Hello, Victoria," Katherine said, her calm voice belying the trembling in her hands. "It's been a long time." Victoria recovered quickly, her face smoothing into a polished mask. "I don't know what kind of cruel joke this is, Richard, but it's in extremely poor taste." "Not a joke, Mother. This is Katherine Moore, very much alive despite what you told me." Richard's voice was cold. "And this is Haley, my daughter, your granddaughter." Victoria's gaze flickered to Haley, taking in the unmistakable Donovan blue eyes and dark hair. Something calculating passed across her face before she turned to the hovering butler. "Bradley, please inform Mrs. Chen that our meeting will be delayed, then ensure we are not disturbed." Once the butler had departed, Victoria settled gracefully into an armchair. "Well, this is certainly unexpected. Katherine, you're looking remarkably well for someone who supposedly died in a car accident." "Cut the act, Victoria," Katherine said. "We know everything. Saint Bernadette's, the false commitment papers, the theft of my baby." Victoria raised an eyebrow. "Such dramatic accusations, if you have grievances. I suggest you take them up with your lawyers, though I doubt any reputable firm would pursue such far-fetched claims without evidence." "We have evidence," Richard said. "Financial transactions from Donovan Shell Companies to St. Bernadette's, testimony from former staff, the falsified death certificate your people created after Katherine's escape." A tense silence filled the room. Victoria's gaze moved slowly from Richard to Katherine, then settled on Haley, who had remained silent, watching the exchange with wary intensity. "You look like him," Victoria said finally, addressing Haley. "When Richard was young, same stubborn expression." Her voice softened almost imperceptibly. "What do you want from us, money, I presume?" Haley's jaw tightened. "I don't want anything from you. Everyone wants something, dear. Best to be honest about it." "I want to know why," Katherine interjected, stepping closer to Victoria. "Why did you destroy 3 lives? What made your family's reputation more important than our happiness?" Victoria's laugh was brittle. "Happiness? How naive you still are. Richard wasn't in love. He was infatuated. You were a distraction at a crucial time in his career. The governorship was practically guaranteed. Then the Senate, possibly more. I never wanted any of that, Richard said quietly. Of course you did. You just didn't recognize it. Victoria's tone was dismissive. Besides, it wasn't just about politics. It was about survival. The Donovans have spent generations building our position. One impulsive marriage to a nobody would have unraveled everything. So you fabricated evidence that I was unfaithful, Katherine said. You made your own son believe I'd betrayed him. It was efficient. Richard's weakness has always been his pride. Victoria shrugged slightly. I expected you to take the settlement and disappear. When you persisted with those pathetic letters, more decisive action became necessary. The casual cruelty of her admission stunned them all into silence. You speak about destroying lives as if you were discussing a business transaction, Haley finally said, her voice tight with controlled anger. Darling, it was a business transaction. Families like ours operate differently than what you're accustomed to. Victoria's gaze was almost pitying. Sentiment is a luxury we cannot afford. Richard stepped forward, physically placing himself between his mother and the two women. That's enough, Mother. You're going to listen now. Katherine and Haley deserve reparations. Victoria's eyes narrowed. Is that what this ambush is about, Money? Justice, Katherine corrected. Acknowledgement of what you did. And what would that accomplish exactly? Shall I write a formal apology? Dear Katherine, sorry for separating you from your unsuitable attachment to my son and giving your illegitimate child a chance at a proper upbringing. Haley moved so quickly that no one had time to react. In 3 strides, she was standing directly over Victoria, her face flushed with fury. I grew up in an underfunded orphanage, believing I was unwanted and abandoned. I had no family, no security, no sense of belonging, while you sat in this mansion counting your millions and protecting your precious legacy. Haley's voice shook. You didn't give me a proper upbringing. You stole my mother, my identity, and my birthright. For the first time, Victoria seemed at a loss for words, something like unease flickering in her eyes as she faced the living embodiment of her machinations. Haley, Katherine said softly, placing a hand on her daughter's arm. She's not worth it. Haley stepped back, her breathing ragged. Victoria recovered her composure, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from her skirt. Well, if it's acknowledgement you want, fine. Yes, I orchestrated Katherine's removal from Richard's life. Yes, I arranged for the child to be placed for adoption, though clearly that plan went awry. She looked directly at Richard. Everything I did was for this family's benefit, including yours, Richard. Whether you recognize it or not. Richard's face had gone pale. You told me she was dead. You let me grieve for years. It was kinder than the truth, that she'd moved on, forgotten you, started a new life. Victoria's expression hardened. Are we finished with this little confrontation? I have actual business to attend to. Katherine stepped forward, her eyes locked on Victoria's. We're far from finished. Your actions weren't just cruel. They were criminal, kidnapping, false imprisonment, fraud. The statute of limitations hasn't expired on all of those crimes. Fear flickered briefly across Victoria's face. You have no proof that would stand up in court, and the scandal would harm you as much as me. Perhaps, Katherine acknowledged. But are you willing to risk your final years fighting legal battles that will destroy whatever legacy you think you've built? Because I'm prepared to spend the rest of my life making sure the world knows exactly who Victoria Donovan really is. The two women stared at each other, decades of pain and manipulation hanging in the air between them. Then Richard suddenly staggered, clutching his head with a groan of pain. Richard, Katherine was at his side instantly. It's nothing, just a headache. He straightened with effort. Mother, this isn't over, but right now we're leaving. As they turned to go, Victoria called out, Richard, don't be foolish. Whatever fantasy reconciliation you're imagining with these people won't replace what you're throwing away. Richard paused at the doorway. No, Mother. What you stole from me can never be replaced, but I can stop the damage from spreading any further. Outside, in the Bentley, no one spoke for several minutes. The confrontation had left them all drained, the temporary satisfaction of facing Victoria overshadowed by the enormity of the harm she had caused. She's not even sorry, Haley finally said, breaking the silence. "People like Victoria never are," Katherine replied. "They see the world only in terms of power and advantage." Richard started the car, his movements slow and deliberate. "The aneurysm," he said quietly. "The doctors warned me that stress could accelerate things." Katherine reached over and covered his hand with hers, the first voluntary contact between them in 25 years. "Let's get you home. Are you sure about this, Ms. Moore? Once we move forward, there's no turning back." Katherine studied the man across from her. Frank Delgado, Richard's driver for over 30 years. His weathered face showed the strain of divided loyalties, but his eyes were clear and determined. "I'm sure, Frank. We need to know everything." They sat in a quiet corner of a downtown coffee shop, far from the Donovan estate and the upscale neighborhoods where Victoria's network of informants operated. Frank had reached out to Katherine privately, claiming he had information about Haley's adoption that hadn't been in Richard's investigator's report. "I should have spoken up years ago," Frank said, running a hand over his thinning gray hair. "But Victoria, she has ways of making problems disappear." "I remember," Katherine said quietly. Frank slid a worn leather portfolio across the table. "After Richard met you at that hospital cafeteria, everything changed. He talked about quitting politics, about marrying you. Victoria was furious. She said as much when we confronted her. What she didn't tell you was how elaborate her plan was. It wasn't just about separating you two." Frank tapped the portfolio. "It was about erasing you completely." Katherine opened the portfolio with trembling fingers. Inside were photocopies of documents spanning decades, financial transfers, internal memos, surveillance reports, a comprehensive record of Victoria Donovan's obsession with controlling her son's life. "How did you get these?" "Bradley, the butler you met. His daughter works in the Donovan Group's records department. He's been quietly collecting evidence for years. After Victoria destroyed his marriage in the 90s, he wanted insurance." Katherine flipped through the pages, her stomach churning. "There's so much here. The important stuff starts on page 12, the agreement with St. Bernadette's." Frank's voice lowered. "And what was supposed to happen to the baby?" Katherine found the page and read, her blood turning to ice. According to the agreement, her daughter was to be adopted by a childless couple in Europe, specifically chosen because they had no connections to America and would raise the child without knowledge of her origins. "But that's not what happened," Katherine said slowly. "Haley ended up at St. Agnes in Vermont." Frank nodded grimly. "That's where things went sideways. The adoption fell through at the last minute. The European couple had a surprise natural pregnancy and backed out. By then, Victoria had already told Richard you were dead. So she couldn't just return the baby to St. Bernadette's. Too many questions. So she dumped my daughter at an orphanage. Not Victoria directly. She assigned the task to James Donovan, Richard's cousin, the one in the fake photos." Katherine felt sick. Another player in Victoria's manipulation. James had his own reasons to help Victoria. He was embezzling from the family foundation. Victoria knew, but kept it quiet in exchange for his assistance with her projects. Frank hesitated. "Including your situation." Katherine flipped to another document. A receipt for a private air ambulance transporting Sarah Williams from Montana to Vermont. Below it, adoption placement papers for St. Agnes Home for Children, with a large donation check attached. "This proves Victoria knew I was alive all these years," Katherine whispered. "She tracked my movements even after the accident. She tracked everyone who could threaten her control," Frank confirmed. "Including me." Katherine looked up sharply. "Why you?" Frank's expression softened with old regret. "Because I tried to warn Richard the day you sent that letter about the baby. I was the one who brought his mail that day. I saw Victoria intercept it. Saw her stamp it refused, without Richard ever knowing it existed. You said something to him. I tried. Told him maybe he should hear your side of the story." Frank shook his head. "Next day, Victoria called me to her office. Had photos of my teenage son buying drugs. Said if I ever mentioned your name to Richard again, she'd make sure my boy went to prison instead of the rehab center she'd generously arranged." Katherine reached across the table and squeezed the old man's hand. "I'm sorry, Frank, for all of us who got caught in her web. Not your fault. But now, with Richard's condition," he trailed off, the weight of wasted years hanging between them. "Is it really that serious?" His condition? Frank nodded gravely. The doctors gave him a year at most. Victoria doesn't know the full prognosis. Richard hasn't told her. Katherine felt a stab of complicated emotions. Decades of anger at Richard's betrayal had dominated her feelings since recovering her memories. But now, facing the reality of his mortality, other emotions were surfacing. Grief, regret, and something she wasn't ready to name. "What do you suggest we do with all this?" she asked, gesturing to the portfolio. "That's up to you and Miss Haley. But if you're planning to go against Victoria legally, you should know she's already making moves." Frank lowered his voice further. "She's meeting with Richard's lawyers. I think she's trying to challenge his control of the Donovan group, claiming his medical condition affects his judgment. Can she do that? With enough money and the right connections? She can try." Frank checked his watch. "I should get back. Victoria has a charity board meeting at 3. As they prepared to leave, Frank hesitated. "There's one more thing you should know about Richard." Katherine paused, suddenly wary. "After he thought you died, he was different, harder, colder, threw himself into the business, expanded it beyond even Victoria's ambitions." Frank's eyes held Katherine's. "But every year, on what would have been your anniversary, he disappears for the day. No meetings, no calls. I'm instructed to drive him to the lake and wait. Lake Michigan, where we first..." Frank nodded. "He sits there for hours looking at the water, never explains why, never brings anyone with him." He shrugged uncomfortably. "Just thought you should know he never really forgot you, even when he thought you were gone." Haley paced the hotel suite, processing everything Katherine had shared from her meeting with Frank. The portfolio lay open on the coffee table, its contents spread out in damning detail. "So this explains why I ended up at St. Agnes instead of with some European family," Haley said, picking up the failed adoption agreement. "A bureaucratic hiccup. That changed everything," Katherine said softly. "If their original plan had worked, we might never have found each other." Haley sat beside her mother on the sofa, still not entirely comfortable calling her mom, but no longer holding her at arm's length either. The past 3 weeks had been a careful dance of boundaries and tentative connections. Haley had moved from her studio apartment to this hotel suite that Richard had arranged, needing the neutral space while she processed the seismic shifts in her identity. Katherine had taken a leave of absence from her job in Vermont, staying in a connecting room, close enough for late-night conversations but respecting Haley's need for space. Richard had kept his distance, making himself available but never imposing. His deteriorating health was increasingly evident in the tremors of his hands, the squinting against sudden headaches, the careful, measured way he moved. Frank also mentioned Victoria is trying to wrest control of the company from Richard, Katherine said. Gathering the documents back into the portfolio, Haley's expression hardened. "Of course she is. She can't stand losing control. Richard needs to know. This affects his inheritance plans." "Why do you care?" Haley asked bluntly. "After everything he did, choosing to believe you betrayed him, letting his mother destroy your life. Why are you concerned about his company or his inheritance?" Katherine was silent for a long moment. "I'm not sure I can explain it rationally. Yes, I'm angry with Richard. Furious, actually. He was weak when I needed him to be strong. He betrayed our love in the worst possible way. But Victoria was the true architect of our destruction. Richard was as much her victim as we were in a different way." Katherine's expression softened slightly. "And now he's dying, Haley. Whatever reckoning I imagined having with him all these years, it won't look like what I thought." Haley stood abruptly and walked to the window, looking out at the Chicago skyline. "I keep trying to hate him," she admitted. "It would be easier if I could just hate him." "Easier than what?" "Than accepting that my father is a real person, complicated, flawed, who might actually care about me." Haley turned back to Katherine, vulnerability written across her face. "All my life, I've imagined my parents as these mysterious figures who abandoned me for reasons I'd never understand. Now I have to reconcile that with reality. With you. With him." Katherine rose and approached her daughter carefully, still mindful of Haley's boundaries. "We have a lot of years to make up for. A lot of healing to do. But we don't have to figure it all out tonight." The suite door opened, and Richard entered, looking exhausted from a day of medical appointments. He stopped short when he saw the portfolio on the coffee table. "What's that?" Katherine and Haley exchanged a glance. Then Katherine stepped forward. Her decision made, "Evidence that your mother is plotting against you," she said, "and proof that what happened to me, to us, was even more calculated than we realized." Richard's gaze moved from Katherine to the documents, then to Haley. In that moment, a silent understanding passed between the three of them. Whatever their complex feelings toward one another, they shared a common enemy. Victoria had orchestrated the destruction of their family once before. They wouldn't let her do it again. Rain lashed against the windows of Richard's downtown penthouse as Katherine sat in a leather armchair, surrounded by the evidence of a life she'd never been allowed to share. Family photos on bookshelves, awards and mementos from Richard's business triumphs, tasteful, expensive art on every wall. "So this is how a Donovan lives," she murmured, more to herself than to Richard, who stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows watching the storm rage over Lake Michigan. "It's just a place," he replied, his voice weary. "Most of it was decorated by designers my mother approved." The portfolio from Frank lay open on the coffee table between them. They'd spent the last 2 hours going through its contents, Richard's expression darkening with each revelation of his mother's manipulations. "I knew she was controlling, even ruthless," he said, turning from the window. "But this level of calculation, monitoring your life for decades, interfering with my business decisions, the surveillance on our own family members," he shook his head in disbelief. "It's pathological." "Where's Haley?" Katherine asked, suddenly aware of how alone they were. It was the first time since their reunion that she and Richard had been together without their daughter as a buffer. "Meeting with my attorney. After what Frank showed us, I want her name added to my estate planning documents immediately." Richard moved carefully to sit across from Katherine, his movements measured to avoid triggering the headaches that now plagued him daily. "Victoria won't waste any time trying to lock her out legally," Katherine nodded, the practical reality of Richard's condition hanging between them. "The doctors, is there really nothing they can do?" A ghost of a smile crossed Richard's face. 3 different specialists. Same answer. Surgery would almost certainly kill me, and the aneurysm could rupture any day. I'm living on borrowed time. I'm sorry. Don't be. In some ways, this diagnosis was the best thing that ever happened to me. His blue eyes, the same startling shade as Haley's, met Katherine's directly. It forced me to face the truth I'd been avoiding for 25 years, that I made the worst mistake of my life when I let you go. Katherine felt her carefully maintained composure begin to crack. "Richard, please let me say this while I still can." He leaned forward, wincing slightly from the movement. "I was a coward, Katherine. I chose family reputation over love. I chose the easier path over standing up for what was right. And because of that weakness, I lost everything that truly mattered." Katherine's hands trembled in her lap. "Why did you believe her? The photos, the lies about me and your cousin? How could you think I would betray you like that?" Pain flickered across Richard's face. "I've asked myself that question every day for decades. The only answer I have is that Victoria knew exactly which insecurities to exploit. I was raised to believe that people wanted Donovans for our money and influence, not for ourselves. I never cared about your money." "I know that now." Richard's voice broke slightly. "I think I knew it then too, but I let my pride and my family's poisonous beliefs override what my heart knew to be true." The silence that followed was heavy with a quarter-century of loss and regret. Outside, lightning flashed, momentarily illuminating Richard's face in stark relief. Katherine was struck by how different he looked from the young man she'd loved. Still handsome, but worn by years and guilt, his features sharpened by the approaching shadow of mortality. "Do you remember the night we went sailing?" she asked suddenly. "That little boat you borrowed from your friend?" Richard's expression softened with the memory. "We got caught in that sudden storm. Had to take shelter in that cove. You were so worried about getting me home late. What my roommates would think. And you said, 'Some experiences are worth a little scandal.'" They finished together. And for a brief moment, it was as if the years between them dissolved. Katherine looked away first, the momentary connection too painful to sustain. "All these years I've had these fragments, memories that didn't make sense because I couldn't remember who I was or where they came from. Songs that made me cry without knowing why. Dreams about a man whose face I could never quite see. Claire Bennett's dreams, Richard said quietly. Yes, but Catherine's memories. She touched the silver locket around her neck. When it all came back, when I remembered everything, the pain was so fresh, Richard. Not 25 years old, but like it had just happened. Finding out I was pregnant, your rejection, the convent, having Haley taken from my arms. Richard's face crumpled. Katherine, Let me finish. Her voice was steady now, determined to speak her truth. I've spent weeks being angry with you, blaming you. Part of me wants to keep blaming you, because it's simpler than facing the whole truth, which is that Victoria couldn't have destroyed us if we hadn't given her the power to do so, if we'd truly trusted each other, if you'd had the courage to defy her, if I'd fought harder to reach you. Katherine wiped away a tear. We were so young, Richard, so naive about how cruel the world can be. Richard reached across the space between them, his hand hovering uncertainly. After a moment's hesitation, Katherine took it, feeling the unfamiliar texture of aged skin, where once there had been youthful smoothness. I know I can never make it right, he said, his voice raw. The years we lost, the pain Haley suffered growing up without us. It's unforgivable. Maybe it's not about forgiveness, Katherine replied. Maybe it's about what we do with the time we have left. The penthouse door opened, and Haley entered, shaking rain from her coat. She stopped when she saw them holding hands, her expression unreadable. Am I interrupting? Katherine withdrew her hand, suddenly self-conscious. Not at all. How was the meeting with the attorney? Haley hung her coat and crossed to join them, bringing with her the fresh scent of rain and youth. Complicated, apparently. Being named as the heir to a multi-billion-dollar empire comes with a lot of paperwork. She glanced between them. You two okay? We're talking, Richard said carefully. There's a lot to process. Haley nodded, then pulled a thin folder from her bag. Speaking of processing, the attorney gave me these. Said they might be relevant to our situation. She handed the folder to Katherine, who opened it to find copies of her own medical records from St. Bernadette's, including detailed notes about Haley's birth. How did he get these? Katherine asked, scanning the documents with a growing sense of horror. Apparently Richard's investigator found them when he was building the case against Victoria, but wanted legal advice before sharing them, Haley explained, her voice tight. They show that the separation wasn't just administrative. It was deliberate medical malpractice. Richard took the papers, his expression darkening as he read. They drugged you during labor, heavily, without consent. Katherine nodded, memories surfacing of the foggy, disoriented state she'd been in during Haley's birth. I remember trying to stay awake, trying to hold on to her. They kept saying I was becoming hysterical and needed to be sedated. According to this, they administered 3 times the normal dose, Richard continued, his voice shaking with rage. And there's a notation. As per V.D. instructions, maintain separation protocols immediately post-delivery. V.D. Victoria Donovan, Haley said flatly. She micromanaged even that. Katherine stared at the papers, a wave of fresh pain washing over her. She didn't just want to separate us. She wanted to make sure I never even had the chance to hold you, to look at your face, to count your fingers and toes. Haley sat beside her mother, their shoulders touching, the most physical contact she'd initiated since their reunion. But we found each other anyway. We did. Katherine looked from her daughter to Richard, feeling the weight of their shared history, the complexity of their tangled paths. Despite everything Victoria did, we're here together. Richard set the papers down, his expression resolute despite the visible pain creasing his forehead. And Victoria will finally answer for what she's done. All of it. How? Haley asked. She spent decades covering her tracks. Not well enough? Richard gestured to Frank's portfolio. Between this and what your mother remembers, we have enough to at least threaten legal action that would expose her completely. You think she'd care about exposure at her age? Katherine asked skeptically. Victoria cares about one thing above all else, the Donovan legacy. Richard's expression was grim. And I'm about to offer her a choice: cooperate with us, or watch that legacy be dismantled and distributed to the charitable causes she's always despised. The storm outside intensified, thunder rolling across the sky like a harbinger of the confrontation to come. In the penthouse, the 3 of them, Mother, father, daughter sat together in a moment of unspoken unity, their shared pain finally giving way to something stronger, a determination to reclaim the family that had been stolen from them. For whatever time remained, the Donovan boardroom occupied the entire top floor of their downtown headquarters, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of Chicago's skyline. The massive oak table, passed down through generations, had witnessed countless power plays, mergers, and family disputes. Today, it would host the most significant confrontation in the family's history. Victoria arrived precisely at 10, accompanied by her personal attorney, Gregory Whitfield, a thin, reptilian man whose loyalty had been purchased decades ago. Her silver hair was immaculate, her posture regal despite her years. Only the tightness around her mouth betrayed any concern about the unexpected meeting Richard had called. "This better be important, Richard. I had to reschedule the hospital foundation board," Victoria said, as she took her customary seat at the opposite end of the table from her son. Richard didn't answer immediately. He was reviewing documents with his own legal team, his movements deliberate as he fought another wave of pain behind his eyes. The aneurysm was getting worse, the headaches more frequent, the visual disturbances more pronounced. Time was running short. "I believe it is," he finally replied, nodding to his assistant to escort in the remaining participants. Victoria's composure cracked when Katherine and Haley entered, followed by Frank Delgado and Bradley the butler. Two additional attorneys trailed behind, carrying thick folders of documents. "What is the meaning of this?" Victoria demanded, rising halfway from her chair. "This is a board meeting, not a family therapy session." "Actually, Mother, it's neither," Richard said calmly. "This is what the legal profession calls a settlement negotiation." Victoria's eyes narrowed. Settlement? For what, precisely? Katherine stepped forward, placing a USB drive on the table. "For 25 years of crimes, Victoria, kidnapping, false imprisonment, medical malpractice, fraud, child abandonment. Shall I continue?" "Ridiculous," Victoria scoffed, but her gaze flickered uncertainly to the drive. "Gregory, what is this nonsense?" Before her attorney could respond, Richard gestured to the large screen at the end of the boardroom. Perhaps a visual aid would help clarify things. The screen came to life, displaying the first of many incriminating documents: financial transfers to St. Bernadette's, medical records with Victoria's initials authorizing Katherine's heavy sedation, surveillance reports tracking Katherine in Vermont long after her supposed death. "You've been busy," Victoria said, her voice cold as she scanned the evidence. "Though I fail to see how ancient history warrants interrupting the operations of a multi-billion-dollar corporation." "Then let's discuss something more recent," Richard replied, nodding to his chief counsel, who slid a document across the table. "Your attempt to have me declared mentally incompetent due to my medical condition. Your secret meetings with board members suggesting I'm no longer fit to lead the company." Victoria didn't flinch. "I'm concerned about your health and judgment, particularly since you've reconnected with your previous association." Her gaze flicked dismissively to Katherine. "The board has a fiduciary responsibility to ensure stable leadership, which is exactly why we're here." Richard's voice remained steady. "To ensure stable leadership after I'm gone." A tense silence filled the room. Victoria's expression shifted subtly, the predatory stillness of someone sensing a trap. "What do you want?" she finally asked. Richard looked to Haley, giving her the floor. It was time for Victoria to understand exactly who she was dealing with. Haley stepped forward, her confidence a stark contrast to the orphaned girl who had once believed herself unwanted. Her dark hair and blue eyes, so like Richard's, emphasized her Donovan heritage in a way that made Victoria visibly uncomfortable. "What we want is simple," Haley said, her voice clear and assured. "First, you will sign a full legal confession detailing everything you did to separate my parents and abandon me to the foster system." Victoria laughed incredulously. "Absolutely not. You will," Haley continued, as if there had been no interruption, "because that confession will never be made public as long as you comply with our second requirement. You will step down from all positions within the Donovan Group and its affiliated organizations, effective immediately. This is outrageous. Third," Haley pressed on, "you will support, publicly and privately, my appointment as Richard's successor." Victoria's face flushed with anger. "You You're a waitress with no business experience, no education in finance or management. The board would never accept such an absurd proposition. Northwestern University, bachelor's in social work, graduating with honors next month, Haley corrected. And I've spent the last 3 weeks being intensively mentored by Richard's executive team. They're quite impressed with my aptitude. It takes more than aptitude to run a corporation of this size, Victoria snapped, which is why Haley will have an experienced executive team supporting her transition. Richard interjected. What she brings that none of them have is a vision for transforming the Donovan legacy from one of ruthless acquisition to meaningful social impact. Victoria turned to her son, genuine confusion breaking through her anger. You would throw away generations of wealth building for social impact. Have you completely lost your mind? On the contrary, Katherine said quietly, he's finally found his conscience. Victoria's attorney leaned in to whisper urgently in her ear, but she waved him away impatiently. And if I refuse this generous arrangement, what then? You expose old family secrets, damage the company's reputation, and then what? The board still won't accept her? She jabbed a finger toward Haley. Richard nodded to his chief counsel, who distributed another document around the table. In that case, I will exercise my controlling interest to dissolve the current board, liquidate our major holdings, and distribute 90% of the proceeds to a new foundation, the Roots of Katherine Foundation, dedicated to supporting single mothers and children in the foster system. Richard's voice was quiet but resolute. The Donovan name will still be attached to a legacy, Mother, just not the one you envisioned. Victoria stared at her son. For once speechless, the room was silent, except for the faint hum of the air conditioning and the shuffling of papers as the attorneys reviewed the documents. You're bluffing, she finally said, but uncertainty had crept into her voice. Try me, Richard challenged, his gaze unwavering. Before Victoria could respond, the boardroom door opened, and Richard's assistant entered hurriedly. I'm sorry to interrupt, Mr. Donovan, but Dr. Patel is on the line. He says it's urgent. A flash of pain crossed Richard's face. Visible to everyone in the room, he stood carefully. Excuse me for a moment. As soon as Richard left, Victoria turned to Katherine, her voice a harsh whisper. What have you done to him? He was rational, successful, until you reappeared with your spawn. Katherine met Victoria's gaze steadily. I haven't done anything to Richard except show him what he lost because of your manipulation. And Haley is your granddaughter, Victoria. Your flesh and blood. The only grandchild you'll ever have. He could have married properly, had legitimate children with someone suitable. But he didn't, Haley observed coolly. Because you destroyed his ability to trust, to love. You got what you wanted, control of Richard's life, and look what it cost him, what it cost all of us. For just a moment, something like doubt flickered across Victoria's features. Then the boardroom door opened again, and Richard returned, his face ashen. Frank Delgado moved quickly to his side, supporting him as he made his way back to his chair. Richard, Katherine asked, alarmed. Just a reminder from Dr. Patel about my medication, he said, but the strain in his voice made it clear that something more serious had transpired. Now, where were we? Victoria studied her son with shrewd eyes. The symptoms are worse, aren't they? The headaches, the vision problems. My health isn't the topic of this meeting, Richard replied firmly. On the contrary, it's the only reason this meeting is happening at all. Victoria's tone shifted, becoming almost gentle. You're afraid you won't have time to secure your daughter's place. For the first time, Richard seemed unsure, vulnerable. Katherine moved to stand beside him, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. Victoria, she said quietly, for once in your life, do the right thing. Not for me, not even for Richard, but for Haley, the granddaughter you never allowed yourself to know. Victoria looked from Katherine to Haley, then to her son. The boardroom fell silent again as she seemed to weigh her options, calculate the odds as she had done throughout her life. Finally, she turned to her attorney. Gregory, review these documents. Make whatever adjustments are necessary to protect my personal assets and reputation. She rose from her chair, straightening her suit jacket with dignity. I'll sign your confession, Richard, and I'll step down, but not for her. She nodded toward Katherine. For you, because despite everything, you are my son." As she moved toward the door, Victoria paused beside Haley, really looking at her for the first time, taking in the determined set of her jaw, the intelligent gleam in her eyes. "You have his stubbornness," she observed, not unkindly, "and her backbone. Perhaps you'll surprise us all." With that, she left, her attorney scurrying after her. The tension in the room dissipated slightly, but Richard's pallor remained alarming. "We need to get you to a hospital," Katherine said, her voice tight with worry. "Not yet," Richard insisted. "There's still too much to do." But as he tried to stand, his legs buckled. Frank and Katherine caught him before he hit the floor, easing him back into the chair as his eyes rolled back. "Call an ambulance," Haley shouted, already pulling out her phone. As the room erupted into activity, Katherine held Richard's hand, watching the man she had once loved more than life itself fight to stay conscious. Their time for reconciliation, for healing, for building the family they should have had, it was slipping away too quickly. "Stay with us," she whispered fiercely. "Please, Richard, stay with us." 1 year later, Katherine stood at the podium, her chestnut hair now streaked with silver, her eyes bright with unshed tears as she surveyed the crowd gathered for the inauguration of the Roots of Katherine Foundation. The converted warehouse in downtown Chicago gleamed with new purpose, its industrial bones now housing offices, meeting spaces, childcare facilities, and transitional apartments for women rebuilding their lives. 26 years ago, she began, her voice steady despite the emotion behind her words. "I was separated from my newborn daughter by circumstances beyond my control. For those of you who have experienced such loss, you know that it creates a void nothing else can fill. The audience, a mix of corporate sponsors, community partners, and program participants, listened in respectful silence. In the front row, Haley sat straight-backed in a tailored navy suit, her father's eyes watching her mother with undisguised pride. What many of you don't know is that 3 months ago, when we were renovating this building, the construction crew found something in the cornerstone of the original structure." Katherine held up a tarnished brass box, a time capsule from 1923, when this building was first constructed. Inside was a letter from the original owner to future generations. She unfolded a yellowed paper with careful fingers. He wrote, "May this building serve as a foundation for growth, a shelter from storms, and a testament to the belief that what we build outlasts what we are. I couldn't have expressed our mission more perfectly if I'd written these words myself." Katherine looked up, meeting her daughter's gaze. "The Roots of Katherine Foundation exists because a family torn apart by power and privilege chose to transform that pain into purpose. We exist to ensure that no mother loses her child to circumstance, that no child grows up believing they were unwanted, and that no family lacks the support needed to stay together through difficult times." She gestured to the building around them. "These walls will shelter mothers in crisis. Our programs will provide education, job training, childcare, and legal advocacy. Our outreach will connect with foster children aging out of the system, ensuring they know they're not alone." Katherine paused, emotion momentarily overwhelming her. Haley rose and joined her at the podium, their hands clasping naturally, drawing strength from each other. "My mother and I found each other against impossible odds," Haley continued, her clear voice carrying through the space. "But we recognize how rare our story is. Too many families remain separated. Too many children grow up without knowing their origins. Too many mothers carry the wound of a child lost to poverty or circumstance." She turned to the side of the stage, where a portrait hung draped in blue cloth. "None of this would have been possible without the vision and generosity of my father, Richard Donovan, who understood that true legacy isn't measured in wealth accumulated but in lives transformed." At Haley's nod, Frank Delgado pulled the cord, revealing a striking portrait of Richard, not the formal corporate image that hung in the Donovan Group headquarters, but a more intimate rendering showing him as he'd looked in his final weeks, his eyes alight with purpose despite his physical decline. Applause filled the room as Katherine and Haley stood together, the resemblance between them more apparent now that they'd spent months in each other's company, the same determined set of their jaws, the same expressive hands, the same capacity for both fierce strength and profound compassion. "We invite you all to tour the facilities," Katherine concluded, "to meet our staff, many of whom have lived experiences similar to our clients, and to learn how you can support this work. Thank you for being part of our new beginning." As the crowd dispersed, moving toward the reception area, Katherine and Haley remained by the portrait. "He would have loved this," Haley said softly. Seeing his mother's face when the foundation made the front page of the Tribune, Katherine smiled. Katherine. Victoria's gracious retirement announcement was a masterpiece of forced dignity. Richard would have appreciated the irony. The 3 months following Richard's collapse in the boardroom had been a blur of hospital rooms, legal documents, and hushed conversations about what might have been. The aneurysm hadn't ruptured completely. A warning leak, the doctors called it, giving them precious additional weeks together. Weeks in which Richard had finalized the transfer of power to Haley, solidified the foundation's structure, and spent long hours with Katherine, rebuilding a connection neither had expected to find again. Victoria had kept her word. Signing the confession and stepping down from her positions, the document remained sealed in a safe deposit box, insurance against any attempt to undermine Haley's position or the foundation's work. She had even attended Richard's funeral, standing stiffly apart from Katherine and Haley, her face an unreadable mask as she watched the empire she had built, being redirected by the granddaughter she had tried to erase. "Ms. Moore, Miss Donovan," a young woman approached hesitantly, clipboard in hand. "The reporters are ready for your interview whenever you're available." "We'll be right there, Lucia," Haley replied with a warm smile. As the assistant departed, she turned back to Katherine. "I still can't get used to being called Mrs. Donovan. It feels like someone else's name." "You wear it well," Katherine assured her. "Better than most who were born to it." They walked together toward the media area, passing through the bright, welcoming spaces designed to feel nothing like institutions. Children's artwork decorated the walls, comfortable furniture invited people to sit and talk, and large windows filled every room with natural light. "I had that dream again last night," Haley said quietly. "The one where we're all together, you, me, and Dad, in some alternate timeline where Victoria never interfered." Katherine nodded. She'd had similar dreams in the months since Richard's death, visions of what their family might have been in a kinder world. "What were we doing this time?" "Something ridiculously normal, teaching me to ride a bike in a suburban driveway." Haley laughed softly. "Dad was being overprotective, and you were telling him to let me fall so I could learn to get back up." "Sounds about right," Katherine said, fighting a fresh wave of grief. "He wanted to protect everyone, fix everything, in those final weeks." "He did his best." Haley stopped walking, turning to face her mother directly. "Do you think, in some way, he made up for what happened, for believing Victoria's lies?" Katherine considered the question carefully. "I think he did everything humanly possible to make amends in the time he had left. And yes, I've forgiven him, for my own sake as much as his." Haley nodded, satisfied with the answer. In the months they'd been rebuilding their relationship, she'd come to trust her mother's honesty, her refusal to sugarcoat difficult truths. It was one of the many things she admired about Katherine: her resilience, her capacity for forgiveness without forgetting, her determination to move forward rather than dwell in the past. As they approached the media area, they could see Frank waiting for them, standing protectively near the cluster of reporters. The loyal driver had become a fixture in their lives. Part employee, part family friend, his knowledge of the Donovan world invaluable as Haley navigated her new role. "Ready?" Katherine asked, straightening her daughter's collar with an automatic maternal gesture that still felt new and precious to them both. "As I'll ever be," Haley replied with a smile that transformed her serious face, making her look momentarily like the young woman she might have been without the weight of her complicated heritage. Before they could step forward, a young woman detached herself from the group of waiting reporters and approached them directly. Something in her determined stride and the set of her shoulders caught Katherine's attention. "Ms. Moore, Ms. Donovan," the young woman extended her hand. "Emily Chen, Chicago Tribune. I'm doing a feature on the foundation and its origins." "Of course," Katherine replied, shaking her hand. "We're happy to answer your questions." Emily's gaze moved between them, an odd intensity in her expression. "Actually, I have a personal interest in your story. You see, my mother was adopted through a private arrangement with a convent in Montana, St. Bernadette's." Katherine and Haley exchanged startled glances. My grandmother has recently been diagnosed with terminal cancer, Emily continued, her voice carefully controlled. Before she dies, she wants to make amends for her role in separating families there. She was a nurse at St. Bernadette's from 1995 to 2003. The significance of those dates wasn't lost on either woman. Catherine's hand instinctively sought Haley's, finding it already reaching for hers. She has records, Emily said quietly. Names, dates, where the babies were sent. She kept them against hospital policy, her own private act of rebellion against what she witnessed there. In that moment, standing in the building that represented both their pain and their healing, Katherine and Haley recognized what this might mean, not just for them, but for countless other families torn apart by the same system that had separated them. Emily, Katherine said softly, I think we need to have a much longer conversation. As they led the young reporter to a private office, Frank watched them go, a small smile on his weathered face. He glanced up at Richard's portrait, nodding slightly as if sharing a private understanding with his former employer. In his pocket was a folded napkin from Bellissimo, the restaurant where Richard had first recognized his daughter. On it, in Richard's increasingly unsteady handwriting, was the message he'd written the night before he died. The love doesn't vanish with time. It transforms. Frank had been saving it for the right moment. Today, with the foundation launched and a new chapter beginning, felt like that moment had finally arrived.